What I'm going to be talking to you about today is really based on my experience. I was with ACE, an environmental justice organization based in Roxbury for about 13 years, and I've been here at UEP. This is the middle of my third year, but I've continued to do a lot of work with the things I'm going to be talking about, which started when I was at ACE. So I'm going to first tell the story of how many people, just show of hands, you guys are familiar, know what environmental racism. I'm going to go ahead and tell that story first because that'll form the backdrop. Some of you will have already read a Favor and Creek study. These guys over at Northeastern who had done what many researchers have done across the country, looking at environmental disparities across race and income. And they were able to rank, what were the hazards per square mile, the density. And what they found was that 24 of the most 30 most environmentally overburdened communities were communities of color. And the others, I think this is kind of remarkable given that I think in their study there were only 30 communities that were qualified as communities of color. High minority communities averaged 23 times more hazardous waste sites per square mile than low minority communities. So these were findings that were consistent with what other folks had found through the last 2 decades. And again, I think these numbers were actually a little bit more than any of us had expected before we took a look at their kind of analysis, but it showed that there are some significant disparities here. This is from Boston Public Health Commission. They regulate all different types of solid waste facilities, including dumpster storage lots, junkyards, trash transfer stations. And you'll notice 2 big spikes here, Dorchester, Roxbury. They had about 2/3 of the sites when this survey was done. I'm going to just show you some of the photos that show, what do these sites look like? I mean, when we show the dot on a map or a bar graph, it doesn't tell the whole story. The picture, this is what a trash transfer station looks like. So this is a trash transfer station that took over 1 lot. What's very interesting about this lot is that it's right across the street from a ball field. You can't see it in the lower right, but it's actually closer to a tot lot, and the Mason Elementary School is just down even further. This is the Bartlett Yard. MBTA owns this site. They shut down a bus yard. They had stored about 200 of their 1,000 buses here for many years, and it is now a classic, what people call a brownfield, right? It's suspected to be contaminated. Nobody's found it yet, but it was a diesel bus maintenance and storage yard for 40, 50 years. But again, this is surrounded, folks who have come on the tours in my environmental justice class know that this site, every side of it is residential. So I wanted to start with the bad news because, I've been in different ways saying that same storyline for now 20 years, ever since I heard the words environmental racism, environmental justice, and got involved in this work. And that's the classic way of telling the story, right? That's basically saying, wow, look, people are literally being dumped on, and there's a racial component to it, there's a socioeconomic component to it, and isn't this terrible? And we've got, it's a civil right issue, it's a issue of equity. And I think just so you understand, the environmental justice movement, when it emerged in the 80s and really blossomed in the 90s, this was the story that was center stage, and you could find it told time over. You just switch the name of the city, name of the neighborhood. Could be a black neighborhood in the south, it could be a Native American reservation out in the west, and it's kind of the same story that has been told. And I guess I'm fast forwarding now because you get to about, I want to mark it, let's just say about 2000. How many folks saw the Al Gore, the movie about Al Gore proselytizing, or have heard about that movie? So there was a moment. I don't know if you guys felt it. There was definitely a moment when I had learned all about climate change, global warming, the science behind it, and all of that when I was in a graduate program in the early 90s. And we knew then, all those curves, of CO2, concentration in the atmosphere, about how it was connected to energy use and to all of the different man-made components of contributing to the greenhouse gas emissions. And for a long time, climate change was still submersed. I mean, you get a hot summer, and all of a sudden, there's some reporting on it, but for a long time, there was the ability to kind of suppress that from becoming something that people talked about in the mainstream. But like I said, about 10 years ago, there seemed like the floodgates opened. A window really opened. And, I want to give Al credit because I think that, it wasn't him alone, but he was certainly part of a wave of voices and folks who were putting out a message about what's happening and why this is something everybody needs to pay attention to. So you guys, I'm just going to assume that that kind of narrative is something that you've heard, it's familiar, but I'm going to just fast forward again to I'm grounded in Massachusetts. So we've done a lot of things here in Massachusetts. Statewide, I mean, this is something that, I think many of us in this room would probably be very proud of, to live in a state where, one, we actually have a statewide target and goals for reducing greenhouse gas emissions statewide. And just last year, the Secretary of Environment and Energy set a target of 25% greenhouse gas emission reductions by 2020. The Global Warming Solutions Act, right, which was passed in 2008, which legislated the development of a plan and the setting of targets, also mandates trying to reach 80% reductions by 2050. And for those of you who are really immersed in all the science and policy and stuff, all the things that the International Panel on Climate Change, right, these mirror some of those recommendations, although now people are saying it's even, right, we've got to aim even higher and go even faster, so, policy's still catching up. But compared to other states, we can say with some legitimacy that Massachusetts is in the forefront of statewide action. So this is the 1990 emissions level, and we're trying to achieve a reduction, right, that gets us to this 25% below 1990. And this is, so we're 2012 here, this is about how we're going to get there. And so if you look at this, each segment here represents how much each kind of set of strategies are going to contribute. And I guess I just want to call out the first one here, right? So they project that if we didn't do anything differently, right, we'd be up here. And then if we implement a set of strategies and policies that deals with the emissions coming out of buildings, we get down to, we shave almost 10% off, right? If we change the way we supply electricity and generate it, we shave another 8%, right? Transportation strategies, another 7.5%. Non-energy, about 2%. Just want to provide a little bit more backdrop because these are some of the driving things that that are shaping how the state through policy is responding to climate change. I already mentioned the Global Warming Solutions Act. Summer of 2008 was quite a remarkable summer in terms of statewide legislative action because that passed at the same time there was a Green Jobs Act that was passed, and it created a Clean Energy Center for Massachusetts and funding sources both for the kinds of green jobs that I'll be talking about and that maybe many of you have in your minds, as well as for kind of high-tech clean energy innovation. The other thing, though, that was really significant was we had the Green Communities Act, which contained a number of different things in that act, but the one that I'm going to focus on is it really changed some of the rules around how utility companies are required to invest in energy efficiency. So we're going to tell a slightly different story to kind of unite these two starting points. I'm just going to try this out on you because this is kind of the new story that I've been trying to tell, which kind of brings the whole picture together from global to local. And so one of the first is just to ask, so this is also a story, this effort is also an effort to try to combine an economic narrative with the environmental narrative. And so the first question that I just want to put out there, who benefits from the fossil fuel economy? When I first put this slide together, it was 2007, I looked at the Forbes, kind of ranking of companies, and they did their top 10, ones that are biggest by revenue, biggest by profit generated. Well, 6 of those top 10 were oil companies. So, so that's just kind of just a little fact to keep in mind. Like, there are huge economic stakes in our current dirty fuel economy. And then, so if we have that as a backdrop, then you can ask, well, who's paid the price? And this is now kind of a different way to talk about what's environmental justice. So environmental justice communities, you might say then, are by definition the folks in communities that have paid the price in different ways. One of which is bearing a share of pollution, right, that is the result of this kind of economy. We can talk about how these environmental justice communities are also some of the ones that have enjoyed the least benefit from the vast wealth that's been generated by this economy, this industrialized economy since for the past 200 years. And when you look at the climate change issue, you can also make the case that, well, these same communities are the ones that they're contributing the least to the problem, but yet they're the most vulnerable. And so that brings us, this is a question that I've had ever since I was in graduate school, which is, what is sustainability? And why would we worry about social issues and equity and stuff like that as part of sustainability? Isn't sustainability just about figuring out how the species can survive within the carrying capacity, right, of our Earth? And but environmental justice, I think, does present a real challenge to that. And I guess the question is now, if we're thinking about a long-term sustainability from any perspective you want to think about, is that really possible without something fundamental about justice as part of that definition? And vice versa. Can we think about pursuing justice if we're trashing the planet? And where we came down on this, we thought sustainability is fundamentally a matter of equity and justice. Our policy decisions now will determine who will have opportunities for many generations to come to access, to share, and control new green wealth. All this kind of comes to the punchline for me, and I'm testing this out. I've been testing this out for a few years, this idea that if you think justice and sustainability are actually intertwined, and maybe in fact parts of the same thing, then let's actually create one word for it. And so I'm testing this out, just sustainability. Maybe that's something we can get our heads around. So what would that be? And I think this report that we did highlights kind of three elements. First is meaningful participation for all, some principle around democracy, decision making. Another is this idea that our economy actually has to be a sustaining economy, one that runs on renewable energy, where our infrastructure is sustainable, where the purpose is not profit maximization, but sufficiency. The other is that green wealth, shared green wealth. So there's some element of this that's about what our economy generates should accrue back to folks who are contributing and participating in that. But how does this translate into the work that we're actually doing from day to day? And this is what I'm going to talk about. And so I'm just going to tell the story from the perspective of ACE. For many of the organizations and partners that are involved in this work, it evolved a little bit differently. But I'll just, from my perspective, ACE started out as an environmental justice organization. We were fighting against all those bad environmental things. We actually started to work a lot on developing and promoting the kinds of things we thought were going to help sustain a healthy neighborhood. Our youth have been working around jobs issues for a number of years, starting in the early 2000s when we had a recession and a fiscal crisis. City and state cut back on all kinds of stuff. And our youth were kind of feeling those impacts, like they couldn't go to the Boys and Girls Club anymore because they lowered the age, and they couldn't get a job in the summertime through the city programs because the number of jobs that were available shrunk. And so they were seeing lots more violence that they were feeling that they could do something about if we could get better jobs for youth. And we started to then see, after a couple of years, we tried to say, well, is there an actual environmental piece to the jobs? Is it just any old job? Or is there something about us as an environmental justice organization that's important? And that's when we were turned on and we started to look at the work that Van Jones was doing in Oakland, California, Green Jobs, Not Jails, and we said, you know what, they're doing this for the same exact reason we are. You know, the youth want safer communities, they want productive opportunities for themselves, they don't want money being spent on building more jails, they want money dedicated to getting us into green jobs. So we were like, what's a green job, right? Well, just happened that, you know, at the same time we were thinking about all this stuff is when the stars were aligning policy-wise on making big public investments in energy efficiency. And so that's our starting point. Okay? The kinds of jobs, this is just a quick overview. You know, so we had done a lot of work with Community Labor United, which is a progressive labor union community collaboration. And so they were kind of the conveners of what I'm going to be talking about, the Green Justice Coalition. But they did some research and found that in residential home retrofits for energy efficiency, every $1 million you invest actually can generate 11 on-site jobs and 5 kind of indirect support jobs. So the Green Justice Coalition, you know, it was, so at ACE we worked with CLU to say, okay, how would we actually build, you know, so now we've got the opportunity to attract a lot of folks into this conversation. We knew that labor unions were going to be interested if there were jobs potentially involved. We knew that obviously our own community groups were going to be really interested in this. And finally, we knew that the environmental groups were going to be very interested in this. We started our work, and instead of just convening a coalition of convenience, if you will, and saying, well, come join this coalition because you're going to get your own little slice of something you care about out of it. We actually took a different tack. We said, we want to build long-standing alliances because we don't want, you know, if we're going to spend all this time doing this work together, we don't want it to just be like we came together, got married for 2 years, and then walked away, right? We said we want this to last because these are actually important alliances that we're going to need for all kinds of things. And so we started that process of building a coalition by forming some principles. The principles were that greening is not only our responsibility, it is our right. A sustainable economy must be as equitable as it is green. And lower income communities and communities of color must be at the forefront of this green wave. So our goals in the first campaign around energy efficiency were to, 1, try to get policy so that we were investing in energy efficiency to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the state. 2nd, we wanted to make sure there was priority access for the folks that needed these energy-saving resources the most. And 3rd, we wanted to create thousands of good green jobs. We didn't want just any old green jobs, but ones that have family-supporting wages, benefits, and career opportunities. We have had a great deal of success over the last couple of years. One is we were part of helping to push and getting approval for the most ambitious energy savings targets in the United States. And that's, like I said before, part of the reason why Massachusetts is ranked #1. We did succeed in substantial investments into this sector. And I think the other 2 things that I'm going to talk about here are really where, for us, we're very proud of. We got community mobilization pilots, so we got these pilot programs that the utilities were agreed to in Chinatown, Chelsea, Lynn, Springfield, and New Bedford. And in each of these places where there were significant kind of low, moderate income, diverse communities, we were going to test out a number of things. We were going to test out, 1, are there different models of delivering these programs that can really rely and build on the community networks that are already in place, the outreach capacity that many local partners already have, and trusted relationships with folks in the community. 3rd thing was trying to test out models so that this actually leads to good jobs for people in the community. And so in each of these pilots, we had agreements set up with union contractors. We had the painters union, the carpenters union, and the laborers union all interested in each of these cities. They have their contractors who have agreed, 1, to create training programs for folks that were identified and referred through the community groups. And so, for instance, in Chinatown, the Painters Union conducted a training all in Chinese. They had 12 workers who completed that training program. In Chelsea, same thing. They have many bilingual Spanish-speaking workers. And then agreement to then, on the jobs that are generated out of this outreach, to hire some of those trainees. A lot of the work in energy efficiency is a lot of the work that's accessible for folks who don't have higher educations is essentially construction work, right? And it's not, these are things that people have been doing for ages, and that's why carpenters, laborers, painters, they all do trades that are related to this work. And they know that the residential construction industry is one that's really rife with exploitation of workers. This is the day labor industry, right? This is where people go and pick up some folks from the corner to come work on a site for a day. Don't get any training, don't get adequate safety protection. Sometimes they don't even get paid what they're owed. Right? Wage theft is the word for that. And a lot of our partners had worker centers that were working with immigrant workers who were actually experiencing these things. So for us, that was a very big deal, and that's why unions were so important, because the unions were one model of how you can ramp into this work and not have it be a dead-end, low-wage job, but something that actually turns into a career. Quickly finish here with just showing you a little bit, we were able to get off the ground these weatherization pilots in Chinatown. That's a picture from the so-called ribbon cutting ceremony, and same thing in Chelsea. And these two are actually winding down now. There was kind of a midway evaluation that was done last fall. But in both these cases, they really proved that utilities partnering with community groups that had trust and outreach capacity already was much more effective. They really were able to reach hundreds and hundreds of homes. We've identified, one, that there is the demand. People, when they find out about this stuff, they really do want to participate. The second thing we proved is that you can actually get people who are local workers trained up and involved in this work. Unfortunately, the amount of work hasn't ramped up as quickly as anybody thought. So even though we had 12 people trained in Chinatown, only about half of them are actually working on the sites. Same thing in Chelsea. There's a lot of red tape, and and it's worth trying to solve a lot of that. But it makes, I think, the point for us even more apparent that some of this requires policy level change, and that we wouldn't have gotten that unless we had actually proved that you could do it at a local scale. And that's what we're going to be fighting for the next couple of years, to make sure that some of the lessons learned are actually integrated across the board, as opposed to we'll just do more pilots here and there. And in the end, we're going to have hundreds of units served by this program, and lots of the folks who've been served have been able to come back and testify to something called the Energy Efficiency Advisory Council, which oversees all of this state planning, which thanks to the Green Justice Coalition, I had a seat on that, representing residential customers. So anyway, I'm going to stop there because I've been talking for quite a bit.